Hey, I'm Liam, your narrator here at Home Studio Stories. I just want to say a very quick thank you to everyone that's liking, subscribing, sharing, and of course listening to the stories here. It's very encouraging to see the support. Also, if you have a scary story that you want to send in, please do to homestudiohorror@gmail.com. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the first story. It was Halloween night, and the streets were alive with the sounds of children's laughter and the rustling of leaves in the crisp autumn air. A group of 6 children, dressed in their finest costumes, were out trick-or-treating in a quiet suburban neighbourhood. As they made their way down the street, they came across an old abandoned house that looked as though it hadn't been lived in for years. Despite the warnings of their parents to stay away from the creepy old place, the children could not resist the lure of adventure. One of the kids, a brave girl named Lily, led the way up the creaky old porch and knocked on the door. There was no answer, of course, but she tried again, harder this time. Suddenly, the door creaked open, revealing a dark and musty interior. The children cautiously stepped inside, their flashlights flickering in the dimly lit foyer. As they explored the house, they came across a room filled with strange artifacts and potions, and suddenly the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The children cried out for help, but their screams went unanswered. That's when they heard the cackling of a laugh from the shadows. They turned to see an old hag of a witch standing before them, grinning wickedly. "Well, well, well," said the witch, her voice sending chills down their spines. "What have we here? A group of foolish young children stumbled into my lair on Halloween night." The children backed away in fear, but the witch blocked their path. "You see, I have a little game I like to play on Halloween," she continued. "I trap children in my house and give them a riddle to solve. If they can solve it, they can leave. If not, they'll be trapped here forever." The children looked at each other, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew they had to solve this riddle if they wanted to escape. The witch cleared her throat and began to speak. "I'm always hungry, and I must always be fed. The finger I touch will soon turn red. What am I?" The children were stumped. They tried to think of an answer, but nothing came to mind. As the minutes ticked by, the children grew more and more desperate. They searched the room for clues and racked their brains, but still couldn't come up with an answer. Finally, it was Lily who spoke up. "I think I know the answer," she said, her voice trembling. "It's fire." The witch cackled with glee. "Well done, little one," she said. "You have solved my riddle. You may leave this place and never return." The door to the room swung open, and the children ran out as fast as they could. They stumbled through the dark and twisted hallways of the old house, their hearts racing with fear. Finally, they burst through the front door and ran out into the safety of the night. They never looked back, but they knew that the witch's lair would always haunt them, reminding them of the dark and dangerous side of Halloween. Adam was a loner, a recluse who spent most of his days in his small, run-down apartment, scrolling through social media and watching movies. His favourite actor was a local celebrity, a man named Jason, who'd appeared in several of Adam's favourite films. One evening, Adam received a mysterious phone call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but he could hear the unmistakable sound of Jason's voice. The actor told him that he had won a contest and that the prize was a visit from Jason himself. Adam couldn't believe his luck. He had never won anything before. A few hours later, there was a knock at the door. Adam opened it to find Jason standing there, looking just as he did on the movie screen. He welcomed the actor inside and couldn't believe his luck. Jason was friendly, charismatic, and full of stories about his time in Hollywood. He regaled Adam with tales of his wild parties and the famous actors he'd met. Adam was entranced by Jason's charm and his larger-than-life personality. As the night wore on though, Adam began to feel uneasy. There was something strange about Jason. He seemed to be growing more erratic with each passing moment. His eyes darted around the room and his movements became jerky and unpredictable. Adam tried to shake off his unease and asked Jason if he'd like some coffee. When he turned his back to the actor to pour the coffee, he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. He collapsed to the ground and everything went black. When Adam woke up, he was tied to a chair in his own living room. Jason was standing in front of him, holding a kitchen knife, his eyes wild, muttering to himself. "You see, Adam," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I am not who you think I am. I'm not an actor. I'm a mental patient escaped from a nearby institution. I've been hiding out in this city, waiting for the perfect victim. And you, my friend, are the perfect victim." Adam struggled against his restraints, but they held fast. He watched in horror as Jason approached him with the knife, his movements jerky and unpredictable. But just as Jason was about to strike, there was a sudden knock at the door. Jason froze, and Adam saw a glimmer of fear in his eyes. "I can't let anyone see me," he muttered to himself. "I have to go." He quickly untied Adam and rushed out the back door. Adam was left alone and terrified. The police arrived a few moments later, responding to a call from Adam's next door neighbour. He had heard screams coming from the apartment. They found Adam trembling on the floor, his apartment in shambles. As the police investigated, they discovered Jason was indeed an escaped mental patient who had been on the run for several weeks. They never found him, and he remained at large, a dark presence lurking in the shadows of the sea. From that day on, Adam never trusted anyone again. He stayed locked up in his apartment, afraid to venture out into the world. And every time he watched a movie or saw a picture of Jason on screen, he shuddered with fear, knowing that the man he once admired was a monster, lurking in the darkness. Samantha had never really been able to connect with anyone on a deep level, and her social life had always been lacking. But one day, while scrolling through Tinder, she matched with a girl named Emily. Emily was stunning. Her profile was full of pictures of her smiling, her bright blue eyes sparkling with mischief. Samantha felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach as they started chatting. They had so much in common, and their conversations flowed so easy. After a few days of chatting though, Emily invited Samantha over to her house. Samantha eagerly accepted, thrilled at the prospect of finally meeting someone she connected with. As she made her way to Emily's house, she couldn't help but feel nervous. She'd never been on a real date before, and she wasn't sure what to expect. When she arrived, Emily greeted her with a warm smile. They hugged and chatted for a bit before Emily invited her inside. The house was dark and gloomy, but Samantha didn't pay much attention to it. She was too focused on Emily, and she thought maybe she was trying to set the mood. Emily led her into the living room and poured her a glass of wine. As they chatted, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was a little off. Emily seemed distant, her eyes clouded with something that Samantha couldn't quite place. Suddenly, Emily stood up, her eyes blazing with anger. "Do you remember me, Samantha?" Samantha's heart raced as she tried to place the girl's face. And then it hit her. Emily was the girl she'd hit with her car years ago. The one she'd killed in a hit-and-run accident. I didn't mean to," Samantha stammered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to hurt you, I swear." But Emily was beyond reason. She had returned as a vengeful spirit, determined to make Samantha pay for what she'd done. The room grew icy cold, and Samantha felt chills running down her spine. Emily's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and Samantha knew that she was in grave danger. Suddenly, Emily lunged at her, her hands wrapping around Samantha's throat. Samantha gasped for air as Emily's grip tightened, her face contorted with rage. Just as Samantha thought it was all over, there was a sudden knock at the door. Emily froze and Samantha managed to wiggle free. She stumbled towards the door, her heart racing. It was the police, responding to a call from another concerned neighbour who'd heard screams coming from the house. As the police investigated, they discovered that Emily had indeed died in a hit-and-run accident years ago, and that Samantha was the driver responsible. Emily was nowhere to be found though. Samantha was arrested and charged with vehicular manslaughter. She spent the rest of her life haunted by the memory of Emily, her vengeful spirit forever etched into her mind. And every time she swiped through Tinder, Samantha couldn't help but wonder if she would ever find someone who could truly love her, unburdened by the weight of her past. James, Marco, Simon and Russell were having a typical sleepover when they stumbled upon a mysterious game hidden in the PS5 Play Store. The game was called Wargimathan, and it had no description or reviews. But the boys were curious, so they downloaded it and began to play. At first, Wargimathan seemed like any other game, but as they progressed through the levels, they noticed that the graphics became more sinister and the gameplay grew more intense, and then something really strange happened. The game's interface disappeared, and they found themselves staring at a screen filled with pulsing red letters that read, "I am Wargimathan, and I will find a body to possess and control." The boys were horrified. They tried to turn off the game, but the console just wouldn't respond. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and the room grew cold, and a deep, sinister voice echoed through the speakers. "You have unleashed me," it said, "and now I will find my body to possess." The boys huddled together in fear. They knew they had to do something, but they had no idea what. Suddenly, James remembered something from school. A verse from the Bible they had learnt in RE. "Submit yourselves to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." James 4:7. He recited the verse out loud, hoping that it'd be enough to drive away the evil entity. Marco, Simon and Russell followed suit, reciting the verses they'd learned in school too. But Wargimathan was strong. It fought back with supernatural force, causing the room to shake and the lights to flicker. "Be strong and courageous," James recited, remembering another verse from the Bible. "Don't be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Deuteronomy 31:6. Slowly but surely, the entity began to dissipate. The room grew brighter, and the screen returned to normal. The boys breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that they had narrowly escaped the clutches of Wargimathan. They uninstalled the game and vowed never to download anything from the store again without thoroughly researching it first. From that night on, they also made it a point to brush up on their Bible verses just in case they ever found themselves in a similar situation again. And they knew that they had the power to resist the devil as long as they had faith and remembered the words of God. After a bit of a whirlwind romance, Sarah and Michael decided to take a honeymoon trip to the Caribbean. They booked a beautiful sailboat for a week of sun, sea and relaxation. On the third day of their voyage, the winds grew stronger and they found themselves a bit lost in the middle of the ocean. Just when they thought all hope was lost though, a beautiful mermaid appeared, calling out to them. "Follow me," she said. "I'll lead you to safety." Sarah and Michael were hesitant at first, but they had heard tales of friendly mermaids in the Caribbean, and they desperately needed help, so they followed the mermaid as she swam gracefully through the water. As they swam deeper into the ocean, Sarah and Michael noticed a strange scent in the air, something like decay and salt. They began to realize that the mermaid was leading them towards a graveyard of boats, tourists and swimmers, all lying at the bottom of the sea. Their hearts pounding, they tried to swim back, but the mermaid had them under her spell. She sang a haunting melody that drowned out all other sounds, and they found themselves moving closer and closer to her. Suddenly the mermaid's face contorted into a grotesque snarl, revealing razor-sharp teeth. Sarah and Michael screamed, but it was too late. The siren had lured them to their doom. As they struggled to break free, they saw the remains of other sailors and tourists, their bodies mangled and torn apart. The siren sang louder and her grip tightened. Sarah and Michael knew their fate was sealed. But Michael remembered something he'd heard as a child. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my saviour," he recited. "He is my shield, the strength of my salvation and my stronghold." Psalm 18:2. Sarah joined in, reciting verses they had learned in Sunday school. Slowly but surely the siren's grip began to weaken. She let out a piercing screech and disappeared into the water. Sarah and Michael swam for their lives, hearts pounding in their chests. They managed to make it back to the sailboat, and with the help of a passing fishing boat, they were rescued and returned to shore. But the memory of that horrific encounter stayed with them for the rest of their lives. They learned that not everything is as it seems, and the power of faith and prayer can conquer even the most sinister of beings. Jeremy was a wealthy and popular man, known for his lavish parties, extravagant lifestyle, and everything he could ever want, except for peace of mind. Because Jeremy had a dark secret he was hiding from the world. Years ago, he'd been involved in a scandalous affair that left him feeling ashamed and guilt-ridden. He feared that one day his past would catch up with him, and he'd be exposed for the fraud he really was. To escape from his own demons, Jeremy found solace in the church. He attended every Sunday, sitting in the back row, praying that no one would recognize him. He tried to be inconspicuous, but the fear of being found out consumed him. One Sunday, a new pastor arrived at the church. Jeremy tried to avoid him, but the pastor seemed to have a special interest in him. He began to notice Jeremy's anxiety and discomfort and offered him a listening ear. Jeremy hesitated at first, but something about the pastor made him feel safe, so he confided in him about his past and his fear of being exposed. The pastor listened patiently and offered him words of comfort and forgiveness. Jeremy felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. He continued to attend church, but now with a sense of peace and hope. He realized that everyone has their secrets and flaws, and that it was never too late to ask for forgiveness and make amends. But one day, as he was leaving church, a group of reporters ambushed him, shouting his name and asking questions about his scandalous past. Jeremy froze, feeling the eyes of the congregation upon him. But then he remembered the pastor's words of forgiveness and strength, and he stood tall and faced the reporters, admitting to his past mistakes and seeking forgiveness from those he'd hurt. The congregation rallied behind him, offering words of support and understanding. Jeremy realized that he'd been living in fear for nothing. He'd found redemption and forgiveness in the church, and he could face the world with a new sense of hope and courage from that day on. Avid hunters, James and Jack loved nothing more than the thrill of the chase. They set out into the forest, determined to catch a prized deer for their trophy room. As they were tracking a deer, they stumbled upon a beautiful nymph, frolicking in a nearby stream. Mesmerized by her beauty and charm, they forgot all about their hunting mission and followed her deeper into the forest. The nymph led them to her home, a beautiful mansion hidden deep within the woods. Inside, she showed them many pleasures, from sumptuous feasts to endless wine and pleasures of the flesh. James and Jack were enchanted by her and her home. They were happy to stay forever, indulging in all the luxuries the nymph provided. But as time passed, they began to realize this wasn't quite right. The food they were eating had a strange, bitter taste, and the wine made them feel dizzy and disorientated like no alcohol they'd ever drank before. And the nymph's beauty seemed to be fading, and her home growing darker and more decrepit. They tried to leave, but the nymph had enchanted them so thoroughly that they couldn't find their way out of the forest. They were trapped in her dark, dank cave, surrounded by rotting food and decaying beauty. The nymph decided to reveal her true form to them, a twisted, grotesque creature with long, sharp claws and a mouth full of broken and jagged teeth. She cackled with delight as she feasted on their flesh, relishing in the taste of her latest victims. James and Jack had fallen prey to the nymph's enchantment, and it had cost them their lives. Their hunting expedition had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the nymph as the ultimate predator. Their fate served as a warning to others who dared to venture into the forest, tempting the whims of the dangerous and alluring creatures that dwell within. There was a fallen angel known as Azazel. He had once been a divine being, an angel tasked with guarding humanity from the darkness that lurked in the shadows. But he had grown tired of his role and longed for something more. One day he made a fatal mistake. He allowed himself to be tempted by the very darkness he was meant to be fighting against. He was cast out of heaven, his wings torn from his back, and forced to roam the earth for all eternity. Azazel soon found that he had a talent for tricking mortals into committing sins. He would whisper in their ear, tempting them with forbidden pleasures, leading them down a path of corruption and decay. Once they had sinned, he would appear to them in the guise of a benefactor, offering them a deal to make things right at the cost of their mortal souls. Over time, Azazel became an expert in the art of manipulation, weaving a web of deceit that ensnared countless souls. He would find the desperate, the broken, the lost, and offer them salvation in exchange for their eternal damnation. His victims were always left with a sense of unease, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, but they pushed it aside, grateful for the chance to make things right, even if it meant sacrificing their own souls. As the years went by, Azazel grew bolder in his pursuits, taking pleasure in the downfall of mortals. He became careless, leaving behind clues that pointed to his true nature. But as his power grew, so did his loneliness. He had fallen so far from grace that he had forgotten what it felt like to be loved and accepted. So he continued even deeper into his dark deeds, a fallen angel roaming the earth, preying on those who had lost their way. But little did he know, his sins had not gone unnoticed. The forces of heaven and hell were watching him, waiting for a moment to strike. And when that moment came, Azazel would learn that even a fallen angel was not beyond redemption. Jenna and Mark, two strangers sat next to each other on a plane, awoke to find themselves encased and encapsulated in the rubble and debris of the flight they had just been on. The plane had crashed, and the world around them was very different. Everything was overgrown with plants, and the air smelled of decay. They looked around confused and saw that there was nobody else. It was as if they were the only two people left in the world. What the hell is going on? Jenna shook her head, equally confused. I don't know, but we need to find out. It was a struggle, but they both managed to free themselves from the chairs they were trapped in. As they got outside of the plane, They looked around and saw nothing but deserted streets. Everything was in disrepair, buildings crumbling, cars abandoned, no sign of life anywhere. The sun was beginning to set, and they started to feel a greater sense of unease, like something more was coming. They walked for hours, trying to find any sign of civilization, but they found nothing except for the overgrown, decaying world around them. As the night set in, they realized they needed to find a safe place to rest. So they searched for shelter. All of a sudden, they heard the sound of something moving in the shadows. It was a type of shadow demon that had been stalking them since they arrived. They tried to run, but it was faster than they were. The demon cornered them in an abandoned building, and they huddled together in fear as it approached them. They saw it had glowing red eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. Jenna and Mark knew that they were in trouble when they heard a voice calling out to them. A woman's voice, but they couldn't see her. The demon turned to face the voice, and it seemed to be afraid. The woman appeared out of nowhere and told Jenna and Mark that she could help them escape this alternate universe, but they had to follow her quickly. They followed the woman through the dark and overgrown streets until they arrived at an ancient-looking portal. The woman told them that this portal could take them back to their world, but they needed to be careful. As they stepped through the portal, they found themselves back in the airport where they had originally boarded the flight. They looked at each other in shock and relief, and then they turned to thank the woman who saved them, but she wasn't there. Jenna and Mark never found out who the woman was or how she'd even helped them, but they knew they had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and they never forgot the feeling of being stalked by that terrifying shadow demon lurking in the shadows of the alternate universe. Mrs. Higgins had always been a solitary woman, content with her books and cats for company. She had long since withdrawn from the outside world, convinced that it had become a dark and evil place. Even the sun seemed dimmer to her, and the birds no longer sang with the same joy they once had. But one thing she couldn't ignore was the feeling that something was watching her in her own home. She would catch glimpses of a shadow out of the corner of her eye, and hear strange noises at night. She was convinced that someone had broken in, but no matter how many times she searched the house, she found nothing out of the ordinary. One night, as she lay in bed reading, she felt a sudden chill in the room. She looked up from her book and saw a figure standing in the doorway. Fear clutched at her heart as she tried to make out who or what it was. Who are you?" she said, her voice shaking. The figure stepped closer, and Mrs. Higgins could see now that it was some sort of creature, skin pale and leathery, and its eyes glowed like embers in the dark.
"I am the darkness you fear,"
it hissed,
"and I have come to claim you."
Mrs. Higgins scrambled out of bed, backing away from the creature. "What do you want from me?" she cried.
"I want your soul, of course,"
the creature replied.
"You've lived a long and empty life, Mrs. Higgins, and it's time for you to pay for wasting it."
Mrs. Higgins was struck with terror as the creature advanced towards her. She tried to run, but her legs were old and they felt like they were made of lead. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Suddenly, she remembered something her mother had told her a long time ago when she was a little girl. "The Lord is my shepherd," her mother had said. "I shall not want." Mrs. Higgins closed her eyes and began to recite the words of the 23rd Psalm, praying that they would be enough to drive the creature away. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me by the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me to paths of righteousness for his name's sake." As she spoke the words, Mrs. Higgins felt a sudden surge of strength. She opened her eyes and saw that the creature was gone, vanished into the darkness. Breathless and shaken, Mrs. Higgins sank on the floor, tears streaming down her face. She knew that the darkness was still out there, waiting for her, but now she had the courage to face it. armed with the knowledge that she was not alone, and that there was a power greater than darkness that could protect her.